So as we agreed, we are just going to look at the 11 pages. This is our reading for week 2 from the Ordinances of Governments or Governance. That is Mawardi's text. We start here. Imamate comes into being in 2 ways, bottom of page 12, and go all the way until last paragraph being it's permitted for the Caliph to stipulate the people of election, just as it's permitted for him to stipulate those from amongst whom one will be chosen. So this is what Umar did, of course, choosing both the electors and the nominees. Thus, it's valid only to choose someone from amongst those stipulated, just as it is only valid to appoint the one to whom succession has been assigned, as these 2 matters are amongst the rights of his khilafah. So what I'll do is go over the Arabic text. The equivalent of these 12 or 11 or 12 pages in the Arabic goes as follows: وَالْإِمَامَةُ تَنْعَقِدُ مِنْ وَجْهَيْنِ أَحَدُهُمَا باختيار أهل الحل والعقد والثاني بعهد الإمام من قبل. So there are 2 ways to create a valid imamate or caliphate. One is the people who bind and loose, or we can translate this different ways. We can say the electors, or the people who have the right to choose a leader. Basically, they're representatives of the community. They're people who usually, if there's no government at all, people will go to and ask for guidance. So they're not self-appointed, they're by virtue of the fact that they take care of people's affairs. And the second one is the succession appointment. So بعهد الإمام من قبل, the same person who received the first election or a prior election can appoint a successor. فأما انعقادها باختيار أهل الحل والعقد فقد اختلف العلماء في عدد من تنعقد به. So as for the first case where the person is chosen by a committee of electors, there's a disagreement as to the number. They disagreed as to whether there is any threshold. على مذاهب شتى. Different views. فقالت طائفة لا تنعقد إلا بجمهور أهل الحل والعقد. It has to be the majority of them. So if I identify these people, we get the majority of them, and they have to be somewhere sitting in one room and choosing, or at least communicating to choose. And you see, جمهور العقد من كل بلد. There's an understanding, of course, that depending on how large the country is, you might have representatives from different homes, like delegates. The delegates who went to the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, for example, people representing all colonies. In that case, it was 13. And in this case, it would be all the big cities or big towns. And there has to be the majority from those representatives. ليكون الرضاء به عاما, so that the consent be generalized. وَالتَّسْلِيمُ لِإِمَامَتِهِ إِجْمَاعًا. So we get to something of a consensus as to the agreement about that person. وهذا مذهب مدفوع, but this is something we can agree to because of what happened with Abu Bakr. ببيعة أبي بكر رضي الله عنه على الخلافة باختيار من حضرها ولم ينتظر ببيعته قدوم غائب عنه. Because it was something that he didn't anticipate. The Prophet died, he needed a successor. You can't wait for all these representatives from different parts of Arabia to come. Another view, قالت طائفة أخرى أقل من تنعقد به منهم الإمامة 5. And we read this together. Why? It's basically, again, the obsession with the precedent, either 5 to begin with or 1 with 4 conceding. And that came from 2 reasons. أحدهما أن بيعة أبي بكر رضي الله عنه انعقدت ب5 اجتمعوا عليها ثم تابعهم الناس فيها. وهم, the 5 are Umar, Abu Ubaid ibn al-Jarrah, Usayd ibn Hudayr, وبشر ibn Sa'ad, وسالم مولى أبي حذيفة. The second way piece of evidence is Umar رضي الله عنه جعل الشورى في 6 ليعقد أحدهم برضا ال5. So Umar really did was put the 6 in charge of choosing from among themselves. One interpretation of this is because one of them will be chosen, then we need the consent of 5, as if the consent of the person who's elected is not counted. So this is another view. Who said that? أكثر الفقهاء والمتكلمين من أهل البصرة. So it was fashionable among the people of Basra. By the way, Mawardi grew up in Basra. He ended up living in Baghdad. The second half of his life, lived about 80 years, 40 in Basra and 40 in Baghdad. He says that the majority of people of this town didn't say Shafi'is or Malikis or anything like that. Basra, of course, had a lot of Hanafis, but also had Shafi'is like himself. وقال آخرون من علماء الكوفة تنعقد بثلاثة يتولى أحدهم برضا الاثنين. So in this scenario, be only three, one being chosen from the three, so then the consent comes from other two. And where does that come from? Again, the analogy with a normal contract, like a marital contract. We've already gone through that on Friday. But let's keep going. وقالت طائفة أخرى تنعقد بواحد. Why? لأن العباس, only one is good. لأن العباس قال لعلي رضوان الله عليهما أمدد يدك أبايعك فيقول الناس عم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بايع ابن عمه ابن عمي فلا يختلف عليك اثنين. So apparently the hesitation in Ali's time was resolved by this statement from Abbas. It's not really clear, but there are historians who say that. In this view, here's the whole commentary of somebody who's saying, no, this is just ridiculous, because of course that's exactly how despotism is created. Someone decides, well, I have enough power and I'm going to say that is my representative. This is a very short section. I think we have 5 in total between pages 12 and 23 in the translation. But this one is one of the most important because it already opens up the discussion. If you notice before that section, there is the discussion about the conditions, who gets that job, and we have the 7 conditions right here. So I didn't ask you to read this, but it is because it's kind of a boring section about 7 conditions. The person has to be essentially good about everything, knowledgeable, etc. And the 7th famous condition of being from a certain lineage. And the reason for the Qurashi lineage is not because this family has angels or anything like that, but it's because at the time of Muhammad's death, Prophet's death, people would concede to those chosen from this family. So it was about obedience, the potential of obedience. And I think this is an issue that we still believe in modern government. We want to pick someone who will not be too controversial for people to listen to, because that person will make laws and will lead militaries and so on. Anyway, so that was a short section that I think is the most decisive. And in fact, if you could read it 5 or 6 times for the idea to seep into your head, I think after that, things get easier. And we'll talk about joining next Friday. So you'll see also how when we get to the borderline, what Carl Schmitt calls the borderline concept and the exceptional situation. This is, by the way, also something I put here. It's up to you. I know Gulstan said we have a lot of Schmitts. Of course, there are a lot of Carl Schmitts also. But this famous Carl Schmitt is the one who wrote Political Theology, and his text just continues to be very important. It's fascination now for leftists, because the guy, even though he went with the Nazis, he gave us the tool with which we can think about any exception. I mean, this is the famous definition: sovereignty is assigned to the person who can decide the exception. So the normal circumstances don't tell you exactly who's in power. It could be a very complicated procedure and an elaborate procedure for normal lawmaking. In the United States, 535 people, and they have to agree. But then who can make an exception? Who can just come and decide, well, now I'm going to take away the right of people to breathe, for example. I can decide the exception. This idea of the borderline concept, borderline case, becomes the general rule. So this is something I'm always looking for when I read political philosophy, because not because I think Carl Schmitt just discovers something that's unique or anything like that. It is the way of politics. It is when we know that we can make exceptions and we're comfortable going to bed making these exceptions, that's when we know exactly who has power. And we'll discuss that on Friday. So in the second section is a little longer, and it is what happens after. So the people who elected agreed to elect. Then they look for those who meet the conditions, candidates, essentially, like you're trying to get to a job. فإذا اجتمع أهل الحل والعقد للاختيار تصفحوا أحوال أهل الإمامة الموجودة فيهم شروطها فقدموا للبيعة منهم أكثرهم فضلا وأكملهم شروطا. So of course, the normal thing is to get the best. ومن يسرع الناس إلى طاعته. This potential for obedience is an important thing. ولا يتوقفون عن بيعته. فإذا تعين لهم ما بين الجماعة من أداهم الاجتهاد والاختياره عرضوها عليه. So if they're able to identify that person, then they make an offer. Very similar to any job. We're going to choose a dean, for example, for the division of the humanities. That's exactly what we do. We hope to get the best, then we offer it to the best. فإن أجاب إليها بايعوه عليه وانعقدت ببيعتهم له الإمامة فلازم كافة الأمة الدخول في بيعته. So once they consented in the name of the Ummah, and therefore the people don't have a choice after that. وإن امتنع, what happens when the best refuses the job, ولم يجب إليها لم يجبر عليه. We can't tell them, oh, you have to, you're the best and there's no other way. If he says no, no. لأنها عقد مراضاة, there has to be consent from both sides. واختيار لا يدخله إكراه ولا إجبار. These are the legal terms. اختيار means that you're entering into the contract out of volition, and ikrah is coercion. Coercion changes the laws a lot, right? Not just in Hanafi law, Shafi'i law, in any system. لا يدخله إكراه ولا إجبار وعُدل عنه إلى من سواه من مستحقيها. So then we go to the next in line, the next best. فلو تكافأ في شروط الإمامة اثنان قدم لها اختيارا أسنهما. So what if we get two who are really equally good? He says, give it to the older. وإن لم تكن زيادة السن مع كمال البلوغ شرطا, even though we don't really think that being older is particular, because more it means more experience. That's not necessarily important once we get to adulthood. So yes, we could stipulate age as to get to at least the person being at least an adult. But once you get that adulthood threshold, it's another threshold question for you. We don't have to say, well, the one who's 50 is better than the one who's 40, because it could be that the one who's 40 is better. فإن بويع أصغرهما سنا جاز. So if we give it to the one who's younger, having both met the threshold of adulthood, that's acceptable. ولو كان أحدهما أعلم والآخر أشجع روعي في الاختيار ما يواجبه حكم الوقت. What if we have two who are equal in every respect, but one is more knowledgeable, one is more courageous, so would be good in war, and one would be good in peace and lawmaking and so on, just being more knowledgeable? Well, it depends on what we need. In time of war, maybe we'll choose the more courageous. In time of complicated issues that require a lot of understanding, we'll get the alim. فإن كانت الحاجة إلى فضل الشجاعة أدعى لانتشار الثغور وظهور البغاة كان الأشجع حقا. In the case of emergency where we have all kinds of rebellions and so on, that's when we get them more courageous. وإن كانت الحاجة إلى فضل العلم أدعى لسكون الدهماء وظهور أهل البدع. If the issue here is that we have too many of أهل البدع, the innovations, the bad opinions that we want to suppress, then we need the knowledgeable person. فإن وقف الاختيار على واحد من اثنين فتنازعاها. If we can give it to either one and then there's a fight, both of them want it. فقد قال بعض الفقهاء إن التنازع فيها لا يكون قدحا مانعا وليس طلب الإمامة مكروها فقد تنازع فيها أهل الشورى فما رد عنها طالب ولا منع عنها راغب. So the fact that they fight for it, if someone actually wins the fight, that doesn't disqualify them, because in fact that happened historically. واختلف الفقهاء فيما يقطع به تنازعهما مع تكافؤ أحوالهما. فقالت طائفة يقرع. Can we ever flip a coin? Can we ever get to a lot? Yes, that's one position, one possibility. And as I said, it's in Aristotle's politics, so it's not completely an innovation or crazy idea. It's not clear to me whether these fuqaha knew of Aristotle and whether he said that, but it is something actually that Arabs also used before Islam. That is to say, when we really can't decide at all, and we're not going to take the view that we go with the more older, assuming that they're better, then we can do a lot. وقال آخرون بل يكون أهل الاختيار بالخيار. If we trust these guys, then that's a moment where we say, let them choose. We think two are equal, but they get to decide, given the circumstance, who is better. So you can see, of course, how it's getting thinner and thinner. It's all opinions. We don't have clear guidance about all these things. So yeah, so the people can decide من غير قرعة فلو تعين لأهل الاختيار واحد هو أفضل الجماعة فبايعوه وحدث بعده من هو أفضل انعقدت ببيعتهم إمامة الأول ولم يجوز العدول عنه. This is another question. What happens when you elect someone who is the best at the time? And then we get to another person, eventually somebody who's clearly better, say 5 years or 6 years into the rule of that first one. We don't change course in the middle because the first one was elected correctly in his time or her time. This is actually a very general rule in Islamic law. If you are in the middle of a prayer, for example, and you do the correct thing at the time. So for example, I can't find the water and I do dry ablution because that's what was available. In the middle of the prayer, I see water. I don't stop the prayer, okay? Because I did it right at the time. This is the idea. Some jurists disagree with that, but this is the general principle, that you don't interrupt something that was valid and at the time of its start. ولو ابتدأوا بايعة المفضول مع وجود الأفضل نظرة. So if they just started to give it to the one who's a little less while the good one is still waiting, then, oh, that needs reflection, that bears reflection. So فإن كان ذلك لعذر, if they did that, for example, they're rushing because they can't wait. إليه من كون الأفضل غائبا أو مريضا أو كان المفضول أطوع في الناس وأقرب إلى القلوب انعقدت بيعته. So if there's any good reason to give it to the one who's slightly less, give it to the A- guy with the presence of an A guy. But if there's a very good reason, then the A- guy is good enough because, for example, we expect people to obey more readily. We shouldn't wait and take a guess. If we know that people will just love that guy, or the better person is just not around. By the way, we're obsessed here also with the Ali case. What if the Shias are right and Ali was actually better than Abu Bakr? Well, Ali was busy burying the Prophet, so giving it to Abu Bakr was not wrong, even if we assume that Ali was better. وإن بويع لغير عذر, I know Mawardi, of course, is Sunni, and he's not assuming that the Shias are right, but this is something you can read between the lines. وإن بويع لغير عذر, so gave it to the lesser, but no good reason for it. فقد اختلف في انعقاد بيعته. Then we have a contract that may be incomplete. اختلف في انعقاد بيعته وصحة إمامته. No, this is صحة إمامته. فذهب طائفة منهم الجاهل إلى أن بيعته لا تنعقد لأن الاختيار إذا دعا إلى أولي الأمرين لم يجد العدول عنه إلى غيره مما ليس أولى باجتهاد. وقال أكثر الفقهاء تجوز إمامته. So my sense is that the editors here made a mistake. This is صحتي. This is a noun. فقد اختلف في انعقاد بيعته وصحة إمامته, because later he elaborates the disagreement. There's one group that says it's not right. Jahil is one of them, among some Mu'tazilis probably. And the majority of the Ash'aris and the Fuqaha would say no. I mean, this is a situation where time matters and the moment of giving a contract is important. Because you can always come up with an argument after the contract has been finalized and say, oh, that was not a good idea. You can always object to an existing government. So تجوز إمامته وصحة بيعته ولا يكون وجود الأفضل مانعا من إمامة المفضول. That becomes a general principle, by the way, in Islamic political philosophy. Can we give it to the mafdul while the afdal is available? Yes, it becomes valid because that person was chosen. It happens all the time. When you get married, you choose someone who might not be the best. When you buy a property, it might not get the best for you. But you do what you know at the time of your knowledge, and once a contract is concluded, it's an authority for future events. So لا يكون وجود الأفضل مانعا إذا لم يكن مقصرا عن شروط الإمام. That has to be a minimum of expectation. If we meet the minimum, then we're good. كما لا يجوز في ولاية القضاء تقليد المفضول مع وجود الأفضل لأن زيادة الفضل مبالغة في الاختيار وليست معتبرة في شيء. So in fact, يجوز كما يجوز, just like it is with judges too. I can appoint the one who is also an A- judge, while there is one who is an A judge. Maybe there is a reason. Maybe he lives too far. Maybe he's irritable. Maybe he has. So you can always choose the one who's good enough, not necessarily the best. فلو تفرد في الوقت بشروط الإمامة واحد لم يشرك فيها غيره تعينت. So only if you can say that in our time this is the only one who can really lead, then you wait. ولم يجوز أن يعدل بها عنه إلى غيره. اختلف أهل العلم في ثبوت إمامته وانعقاد ولايته بغير عقد ولا اختيار. What happens? There is no عقد. ذهب بعض فقهاء العراق إلى ثبوت ولايته وانعقاد إمامته وحمل الأمة على طاعته وإن لم يعقدها أهل الاختيار لأن مقصود الاختيار تمييز الولي. So for whatever way he came to power, no contract, but everybody recognizes him as the powerful person. So they disagreed. So the Hanafis, the Iraqis, say he's okay, he's a ruler, in fact, because all we need is just to make sure that we know who the ruler is. And the majority hesitated here, said, أن إمامته لا تنعقد إلا بالرضا والاختيار. These people are formalists. They insist that we need a contract. We need some kind of something to distinguish this happening just by virtue of brute force versus it happening legally. لكن they said يلزم أهل الاختيار عقد الإمامة له. So if the person is really powerful, then we need the contract retroactively. فإن اتفقوا أتموا لأن الإمامة عقد لا يتم إلا بعقد. وكالقضاء إذا لم يكن من يصلح له إلا واحد لم يصر قاضيا حتى يولاه أو يتولاه. فركب بعض من قال بذلك المذهب هذا الباب وقال يصير قاضيا إذا تفرد بصفته كما يصير المنفرد بصفته إمام. So the analogy with the judge, how far does it go? If you have a judge who's appointed, and we're not clear if that person was actually given a proper appointment based on a contract, is that acceptable? Well, if that judge was known to be the only one who can do the job, then maybe. But they made out of these two views a view that once the judge was identified as the good one, then he becomes a judge and we don't need a contract. Others say لا يصير المنفرد قاضيا وإن صار المنفرد إماما, that license has to be available only in the top government position. That is to say, because it's so important. I mean, with a judge, you can wait, the community can continue to deal with this, but with a judge, no, you're going too far by saying that just by virtue of the presence of a judge without a contract that happens. You see, all these emergency situations are in his mind when he's thinking. You have to go back to Carl Schmitt if you're not clear what's going on here. Anyway, وفرق بينهما بأن القضاء نيابة خاصة يجوز صرفه عنه مع بقائه على صفته فلم تنعقد ولايته إلا بتقليد مستنيب له والإمامة من الحقوق العامة. So the distinction comes from the fact that clearly the imamah is very different. This is a general thing, and it is both. It has this quality that it is both about people's rights and about God's rights. It's such a unique thing because without it, most things don't work out. We'll see also what Juwaini thinks about that. It's actually without it, we will fall back on something like it. But anyway, but this view goes لا يجوز صرف ما استقرت فيه إذا كان على صفة فلم يفتقر تقليد مستحقها مع تميزه إلى عقد مستثبت له. So that's the distinction. Let me stop here and record the rest in a different video.